Hello and salutations, my fellow philosophers. Welcome back to the Philos-Hippie Podcast, in which we explore the intersection of philosophy and spirituality so that we can live more meaningful and holistic secular lives. So today I'm actually starting something new on the channel. Today will be the first episode in a series talking about the philosophical dimensions of travel for the next month and a half or so. This is because I've had the great opportunity to travel all over the country and even some places around the globe. And for me personally, philosophy has helped to deeply enrich a lot of these experiences for me in meaningful ways. And I wanted to share some insights in that regard to hopefully inspire others to travel with more wisdom and more profundity. So I just wanted to start today's dialogue by quoting traveler extraordinaire Anthony Bourdain. Bourdain once quoted a wise and anonymous desert prophet. Maybe it was Muhammad, no one really knows. But the quote says, "Don't tell me what a man says. Don't tell me what a man knows. Tell me where he's traveled." End quote. Now, there's something profoundly insightful about this short aphorism here. It realizes that someone can have a world-class Ivy League education while having little knowledge of the actual world itself. You see, humanity is like a multifaceted diamond that shines its vibrant culture in each and every direction. And traveling is the vehicle that allows you to appreciate the sparkling gem of humanity in all its magnificence. It also provides the road, metaphorically and literally, for gaining a profoundly deeper education of the world than anything you could learn in university. Because traveling is one of the most powerful methods for reshaping your philosophical framework and outlook of the world. In fact, philosophy and travel have always been intertwined into each other and have been throughout millennia. The true philosopher is someone who is prime and ready for exploring the world because their open-mindedness and wide perspective allows them to encounter exotic cultures without being tainted by the judgments and biases that their fellow citizens from home inherited. So, if travel truly has the power to reshape the way we see the world, a deeper question naturally emerges. How does it actually do this? What is it about leaving home that stretches the mind in ways that books alone and school at home cannot? Interestingly, this is not a new insight. Long before travel became the Instagram-optimized industry that we see today, it was understood in a much more serious and intellectually formative way. My favorite travel writer and fellow Kansan, Rolf Potts, captures this beautifully in his personally for me life-changing book, Vagabonding, where he writes, quote, "Before the development of tourism, travel was conceived to be like study, and its fruits were considered to be the adornment of the mind and formation of judgment. The traveler was a student of what he sought." End quote. And nowhere was this philosophy of travel more deeply embodied than in the tradition of the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour, not the TV show by the way, was initially a rite of passage for elite Europeans where their education literally required them to travel. Young aristocrats, once they came of age of roughly 21 years old, they would travel all over Europe to experience music they could never hear elsewhere, see masterpieces of renowned art with their own eyes, and learn from cultures they only read of from books. The Grand Tour was a cultural legacy that seeped its travelers in a rich understanding of classical antiquity and the Renaissance. Many of the most famous historical figures that shaped the culture of the European modern age and Enlightenment itself all participated in the Grand Tour. Figures such as John Milton, Lord Byron, Adam Smith, and Goethe all partook in the Grand Tour. And Goethe's Grand Tour is particularly interesting because he said, quote, "My purpose in making this wonderful journey is not to delude myself, but to discover myself in the objects I see. Nothing, above all, is comparable to the new life that a reflective person experiences when he observes a new country. Though I am still always myself, I believe I have been changed to the very marrow of my bones." End quote. Goethe's account is particularly fascinating because Goethe saw his journey to Italy as an inner quest rather than an external one that resulted in a profound transformation for him. Traveling with the mindset of a student of life is profound because it transforms the whole world itself into a classroom with endless opportunities to engage in self-examination, which is at the heart of a robust philosophical education, as Socrates would claim. But this raises an important question. If travel truly has the power to transform us to the marrow of our bones, what exactly is doing the transforming? The answer, I think, lies in something both simple and deeply unsettling. Travel forces us into direct encounter with otherness. And it is this encounter with what is unfamiliar, disorienting, and sometimes even uncomfortable that begins to rearrange the architecture of our assumptions. Nowhere is this best demonstrated than through Michel de Montaigne's essay on cannibals in 1580. Though he never personally traveled to Brazil himself, Montaigne was fascinated by the Brazilian indigenous tribe of the Tupinamba people. The Tupinamba tribe gained worldwide notoriety during the late Renaissance because they were cannibals. But however, they were cannibals that would just eat the flesh of their defeated enemies. I mean, how bad could that be, right? But you see, Europe had a judgmental tendency to describe anything unlike their ways of traditions and local customs as immediately and inherently barbaric. Montaigne famously declared that every man calls barbarous anything he is not accustomed to. In fact, the word barbarism came from the ancient Greeks who simply thought that foreigners' languages sounded like unintelligible bar noises to Greek ears. While the Tupinamba were most certainly cannibals, Montaigne did not think they were barbaric cannibals. Crucial distinction. After conversing with 3 Tupinamba men from Brazil and France, Montaigne learned that their culture wasn't as barbaric as it may seem. Because the Tupinamba natives only ate their enemies after they were already dead, never disemboweling them while alive. Eating one's enemies were seen as a form of extreme revenge and was a symbolic ritual to show bravery. On top of that, Montaigne admired the natives for living in a society that lacked the vices of Europe. On top of that, Montaigne admired the natives for living in a society that lacked the inherent vices of Europe and which allowed them to live more harmoniously with nature. This inspired Montaigne to make the radical assertion that Europeans were actually more barbaric than the ritual cannibalist of indigenous Brazil. Montaigne said that, quote, "I think there is more barbarity in eating a man alive than in eating him dead, and in tearing by tortures into rack a body still full of feeling, as we do not only read but seen in recent times, under the pretext of piety and religion." End quote. Montaigne wrote during the rise of the Roman Inquisition in Europe, in which utilized the most sophisticated torture systems the world had ever seen. To try and establish Catholic dominance and squash the Protestant rebellion, inquisitors would torture religious and political dissidents with a variety of torture devices, such as the batog, the strappado, and the infamous rack. Montaigne said that the Tupinamba natives he talked with were repulsed by this European behavior. They were also perplexed as to why poor people would submit to a bearded king rather than killing him, and simply could not understand why the wealthy were not sharing with the poor. The phrase "eat the rich" has never rung so true before, literally. Montaigne thought that these European practices and attitudes were fundamentally more barbaric than anything the Tupinamba tribe ever did, and that it was also incredibly hypocritical of Europe to give themselves praise and think themselves superior to people who did not share their same ways. Montaigne's essay was ahead of its time, inspiring the political philosopher Rousseau's concept of the noble savage, and also paved the way for moral relativism to gain greater influence in later thinkers' ideas. What made Montaigne such a profound and influential philosopher was because he never wavered in the face of otherness. Montaigne realized something that most armchair thinkers miss. The foreigner is not just an object of study, it's a mirror. They become a reflection of one's viewpoint and attitudes. Exposing oneself to other cultures and the world's beauty forces one to be in constant dialectic with the reality itself. Because when we stay put in our normal homes and towns, we aren't able to get a good view of the culture we grew up in. Because culture is like an ocean. Its tides push and pull us like an invisible force. And just like a fish in water, we don't realize how a culture affects us until we are outside of it. The first thing travel disrupts is not the world, but rather it is our sense that our way of seeing the world was never neutral or unbiased to begin with. It destabilizes the ego's illusion of normalcy and reverts us back into a childlike state that infuses the world with newfound awe and curiosity. In Paulo Coelho's book, The Pilgrimage, he writes that, quote, "Travel can be compared to childhood. Everything you see is new and emotionally affecting. Basic tasks like eating and sleeping take on a heightened significance. And entertainment can be found in the simplest curiosities and novelties. Suddenly you're 5 years old again," Bill Bryson observed in Neither Here Nor There. "You can't read anything. You only have the most rudimentary sense of how things work. You can't read anything. You only have the most rudimentary sense of how things work. You can't even reliably cross a street without endangering your life. Your whole existence becomes a series of interesting guesses." When you travel, you experience in a very practical way the act of rebirth. You confront completely new situations, the day passes more slowly, and on most journeys you don't even understand the language the people speak. You begin to be more accessible to others because they may be able to help you in difficult situations. End quote. What I find so philosophically rich about Coelho's and Bryson's observation here is that it reveals the real mechanism behind travel's transformative power. When we are children, the world feels enormous because everything is new, uncertain, and emotionally charged. But as adults, familiarity begins to numb our sense of perception as everything gets blurred together in our routines. We move through our daily environments half awake, guided more by habit than by attention. Travel disrupts this trance. It returns us, however briefly, to a state of heightened awareness where even crossing the street requires conscious thought. Travel allows one to tap into the beginner's mind, commonly talked about in Zen philosophy, because being in exotic lands forces you into a state of constant perceptual renewal. Travel strips away the normal habits and patterns that structure our mind and make us capable of seeing the world through new eyes. And it is precisely in this beginner's mind state of renewed attention that the mind becomes most elastic, most humble, and most capable of growth. So if travel has the power to awaken us and completely change our worlds, then why do millions travel and remain fundamentally unchanged? And oftentimes turn out worse than before they ever traveled to begin with. But let's take a quick tour and explore why. It's tourism. Yeah, that's basically it. Tour over, but however, on a deeper level. In our era of social media, the world of travel influencers have corroded what it means to travel by treating it just as another product to consume. Seeing a famous landmark or eating the finest high cuisine is done not out of the sake of experiencing a foreign culture, but is rather done to boost one's status and one's ego. Any authentic experience one used to get while traveling have now all been commodified, and any encounters with local natives have become merely transactional. All tourists have to show their friends and families of their travel experiences are not interesting stories and memories to share, but simply cheap and heavily manufactured souvenirs with a slightly different camera roll than before. But there is also a deeper reason as to why tourism prevents authentic travel experiences. Unsurprisingly, this obsession isn't unique to the social media age. Many thinkers throughout the years have written about the fundamental differences between travelers and tourists. In the 1920s, G.K. Chesterton wrote that, "The traveler sees what he sees, but the tourist sees what he has come to see." In 1961, the famous historian Daniel Boorstin said that the traveler was active. He went strenuously in search of people, of adventure, of experience. The tourist is passive. He expects interesting things to happen to him. Then in 1992, Paul Thoreau said that tourists don't know where they've been, while travelers don't know where they're going. And finally, Iyer said in 2000 that travelers are those who leave their assumptions at home, and tourists are those who don't. But all these thinkers and quotes that I stole from Rolf Pott's vagabonding book, they all share the same common assumption that travel does not inherently produce transformation. The true difference lies in how one travels. All the prior quotes circle around something psychologically profound. The tourist does not actually want to be changed. They merely want to be entertained while remaining fundamentally intact. The tourist never gets to experience true culture shock because they never fully immerse themselves in the culture to begin with. It's because most of the time, people travel to exotic and foreign lands just to escape the normal pressures of their lives back home. There's nothing inherently wrong with sipping on margaritas by the beach. But if that is your only version of what travel truly entails, then you're missing out on so much the world has to offer. So this all begs the question, how can we actually begin to take advantage of the world has to offer? How can we free ourselves from the tourist label and not be scorned by the locals while traveling their countries? How do we actually master the philosophical art of traveling? Well, before you ever take flight and hit the road, it is best to have some expectations of what lies ahead. Or should I say lack of expectations. In the Tao De Jing, Laozi once said that a good traveler has no fixed plan and is not intent on arriving. Entering a new place with presupposed ideas and intentions spoils the fun of traveling. Rolf Potts says in Vagabonding that, quote, "The reason vagabonding is so appealing is that it promises to show you the destinations and experiences you've dreamed about. But the reason vagabonding is so addictive is that, joyfully, you'll never quite find what you dreamed. Indeed, the most vivid travel experiences usually find you by accident. In this way, vagabonding is not just a process of discovering the world, but a way of seeing, an attitude that prepares you to find the things you weren't looking for. End quote. Something utterly magical happens when you drop your expectations and receive the world in open arms. Comparison is the thief of joy, as they often say, and our expectations often rob us of the joys traveling has to offer. I was once in Italy visiting the Tower of Pisa, and what I remember most from that day is not taking the iconic statue poses where you're holding the Tower of Pisa in your hands, but rather it was when me and my friends were getting scammed by fake Gucci merchandisers in the plaza that were trying to take advantage of some American teens, and my friends were trying to barter with them the whole time and just all miserably failing. Obviously, none of us bought anything, thank goodness, but that interaction crafted a new story for me to tell and something to finally look back on. You see, because true travel is not crossing off your bucket list, but as simple as it sounds, just seeing where life takes you. Rolf Potts captures this beautifully when he writes later that, quote, "The secret of an adventure, then, is not to carefully seek it out, but to travel in such a way that it finds you," end quote. When one gains this adventurous attitude, serendipity becomes your aimless goal. One of my favorite things to do when exploring a new place is to purposely get lost. I try not to trust my phone, but trust my senses as to where I should go. The scent of freshly baked bread guides my nose, live music being paraded around the corner brings in my ears, and walking past artists on the street selling their works draws in my sights. Your intuition will lead you to places you never would have gone to if you planned out your itinerary with booked out excursions way ahead of time. When Rolf Potts says that adventure finds you, what he's really describing is an attitude of receptivity. Potts even thinks that this could be the basis of a spiritual practice when he writes that, quote, "In this way, seeing as you travel is somewhat of a spiritual exercise, a process not of seeking interesting surroundings, but of being continually interested in whatever surrounds you," end quote. Trying to find out how we can live spiritual lives while not being religious is a running theme on this channel. So you should go check out my spiritual exercises crash course episode to get a deeper understanding of what they are and how they can help those of us who are spiritual and philosophical, or spiritual but not religious, in crafting a spiritual practice that is distanced away from the dogmas of institutional religion. But anyways, one can only embrace this attitude if they see all of life as an adventure and not restricting adventure to foreign exotic lands. One can only embrace this attitude if they see all of life as an adventure itself, and not solely restricting adventure to exotic lands. Potts once again says that, quote, "Life is adventure. Travel is adventure with a different address. Seek and you shall find is not an adage that works in this case. Adventure has a way of finding people, and some people find it more than others," end quote. You see, because a true adventurer always opens themselves up to new experiences. Spontaneity becomes the new god one worships while on the road. Henry David Thoreau gives some practical advice on accomplishing this. He writes in The Walden that, quote, "To do this, you first need to overcome the protective habits of home and open yourself up to unpredictability. As you begin to practice this openness, you'll quickly discover adventure in the simple reality of a world that defies your expectations. More often than not, you'll discover that adventure is a decision after the fact, a way to deciphering an event or an experience that you can't quite explain. Rise free from care before the dawn, and seek adventures. Let the moon find thee by other lakes, and the night overtake thee everywhere at home. There are no larger fields than these, no worthier games than may here be played," end quote. When Thoreau urges us to overcome these habits of home, he's not suggesting recklessness. He is suggesting the courage to step outside the mental structures of the ego. Home protects us from uncertainty. It protects us from misunderstanding. And it protects us from challenging ourselves, because if there's one thing you will experience on the road, it will be obstacles, but that shouldn't stop us from experiencing life's novelties. Henry Miller, famed American novelist, once wrote that, quote, "Life has no other discipline to impose, if we would but realize it, than to accept life unquestioningly. Everything we deny, denigrate, or despise serves to defeat us in the end. What seems nasty, painful, evil can become a source of beauty, joy, and strength, if faced with an open mind. Every moment is golden for him who has the vision to realize it as such," end quote. Friedrich Nietzsche's life-affirming philosophy rings loud and true here. The true adventurer, the philosophical traveler, does not cower or hide away when the going gets tough, but rather throws themselves into the fray with full force. Using Nietzsche's terminology, Miller is basically saying that only the yes-sayer can extract all the joys the world has to offer. The road will throw many obstacles in your way. Every misadventure has the opportunity to transmute that suffering into sublimation, into a story to tell your grandchildren, or into a larger meaning and life purpose. It's starting to get a little bright out. I need my shades. Anyways, if we truly take Thoreau, Miller, and Nietzsche seriously here, then openness is not just a travel strategy and mindset. It is existential training. When you accept unpredictability instead of resisting it, something subtle begins to shift. The obstacles on the road stop feeling like interruptions to the experience and start becoming the experience itself. The missed bus, the wrong exit, the awkward language barriers, these are no longer threats to your itinerary, but invitations to respond creatively. And once you begin responding creatively, you're no longer merely moving through a place. You're being reshaped by it, because unpredictability does something that comfort never can. It loosens the rigidity of identity. At home, you're reinforced daily by the same roles, the same expectations, the same unspoken scripts. But on the road, those scripts lose their authority. You're no longer categorized in the same way as before. The usual mirrors that reflect your identity back to you are suddenly gone. One of the greatest gifts that most seasoned travelers know is that it offers the perfect opportunity to reinvent oneself. Iyer wrote in his 2001 book, The Global Soul, Jet Lag, Shopping Malls, and the Search for Home. He wrote that, quote, "Abroad we are free of caste and job and standing. People cannot put a tag to us. Freed of inessential labels, we have the opportunity to come into contact with essential parts of ourselves, which may explain why we feel most alive when far from home," end quote. When we travel, we are high off of life itself. Because travel is like constantly tripping on a psychedelic because it dissolves our normal sense of self and hijacks our default mode network. When we experience culture shock, it humbles us. And our neuroplastic brains are primed and ready for us to shape and mold it in whatever way we like. What begins as personal reinvention on the road has broader ethical implications, however. Because when identity loosens, nationalism loosens with it. When you recognize how contingent your own subjective habits and values are, it becomes harder to treat them as the objective measure of all things. In whatever way you decide to reinvent yourself, there is one thing that will take hold in the hearts of every traveler: a dutiful love and a respect for anyone, anywhere in the world. Although a map becomes a traveler's best friends, the lines and boundaries of states and countries begin to dissolve in the psyche the longer they are on the road. Meeting locals and experiencing their native culture makes one realize how similar humans really are, no matter your nation or tribe. Ancient philosophers in Greece and Rome also recognized this all the way back in antiquity. When asked where Diogenes the Cynic came from, he famously declared that, "I am not an Athenian or a Greek, but a citizen of the world." He was not denying that Athens existed, but rather that cosmopolitanism had ultimate moral authority over his identity. In fact, this is said to be the origin of the idea of cosmopolitanism itself, which is just a simple combination of the Greek words cosmos, which meant the whole or the universe or world, and polis, which meant city-state. Later, Roman Stoic philosophers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius adapted this idea to imply that the cosmos or world itself was their whole polis or city-state. Even in ancient China, they practiced this under a different name, Qianxia, which roughly translates to all under heaven. Tied to Confucianism, this concept emphasizes hospitality over hostility and relationships with others over the individual. However, despite their progressivism, I still want to be a stranger in a foreign land in the past. But today, however, is a different story. In his book Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers, Appiah makes the claim that being a global citizen, a cosmopolitan, includes two moral responsibilities. First, that we have moral obligations to everyone, even if they are strangers who don't share the same customs as us. And secondly, we must respect other people's practices and beliefs, even if we disagree with them. He writes in it that, quote, "Cosmopolitanism has always combined a respect for universality with the recognition that there are forms of difference that should be allowed to persist," end quote. After Montaigne's propagation of moral relativism in Europe, Appiah is trying to find something that all cultures and nations can agree on, in order to create greater social harmony. He finds relativism to be an issue because there's no shared meaning in which we all carry pieces of a broken mirror, even though no one's truth is better than anyone else's. This is why he thinks the concept of cosmopolitanism is so powerful. It gives us a universal standard anyone can adhere to anywhere in the world. He so eloquently writes that, quote, "The boundary of the state is not the boundary of your moral concern," end quote. You see, travel accelerates this moral education. When the stranger is no longer a mental abstraction, but someone who has given you directions, invited you into their homes, and cooked for you, the idea of global citizenship stops sounding poetic and starts to feel practical. Appiah's two moral commitments, our obligations to strangers and respect for difference, are not abstract ideals in some ivory tower. They are habits cultivated on the road. To travel well, to travel philosophically, is to practice both. Cosmopolitanism does not demand that you agree with everything that you see. It demands that you resist the reflex to immediately dismiss it. It asks for conversation rather than condemnation. And travel becomes a training ground for this almost spiritual discipline. This is exactly how travel broadens the mind. It becomes the highest manifestation of philosophical travel. It not only allows us to experience the world in all its majesty, but it also broadens our capacity as moral agents to love and appreciate humanity's ever-expansive cultures. Because travel is not merely adventure. When approached as a spiritual exercise like Potts talked about earlier, travel becomes the perfect vehicle for self-examination and the cultivation of a more expansive morality. Traveling is so powerful because exploring new lands and interacting with exotic cultures becomes a mirror of one's habitual processes. The Buddha once said, "We see as we are," and this becomes quite evident as we travel. Travel, when done reflexively, dissolves the fantasy that your perspective is the neutral and objective measure of reality. It exposes the contingency of your habits, your politics, your assumptions about success, productivity, and even happiness. And in exposing that contingency, it makes one more humble and gracious in their interactions with others. When you repeatedly encounter difference without retreating into fear, your world expands in more than one sense. You begin to see that your customs are not commandments etched into the structure of reality. They are local solutions to universal problems. Other cultures have devised different solutions. Some you may admire, some you may critique. But you can no longer pretend that they are irrational simply because they are unfamiliar. Cosmopolitanism is not rootlessness. It is not the abandonment and self-imposed exile of your home. It is the recognition that loving your home does not require diminishing someone else's. It is the widening of the circle of concern without erasing particularity. The seasoned traveler can return home more grounded, not less, because they now understand it as one expression among many rather than the measure of all things. If Montaigne taught us that the foreigner is a mirror, Thoreau teaching us that unpredictability is a teacher, and Nietzsche teaching us to say yes to life in all its chaos, then cosmopolitanism becomes the ethical fruit of all three. These teachings help you encounter otherness. It allows you to affirm the experience rather than recoil from it. And from that life affirmation, you affirm the experience rather than recoil from it. And from that life affirmation grows respect and compassion for all. And if I zoom out for a second, this is really what I've been building towards in this episode. Like any psychedelic, travel reshapes perception, which reshapes identity. You're able to fully reinvent yourself on the road when your identity loosens, and in this way, compassion broadens not just the mind, but also the heart. You begin to see yourself not just as a citizen of one place, but as someone participating in a much larger human story. If travel is done philosophically, it does not simply add tourist destinations and landmarks to your camera roll. Travel, when approached as a spiritual exercise, radically alters how you inhabit and carry yourself in the world. This is what it means to travel well. So what are you doing? Get off this video and hit the road. The world is waiting for you to explore it and radically transform you in the process. Now, I want to sincerely thank you for making it to the end of this video on the Philos-Hippie Podcast. I hope you found it enlightening and inspiring, and that you'll continue to travel with me on this philosophical arc as we continue to explore the philosophical dimensions of travel, so that we can become proper global citizens. So if you like this kind of content, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and return back here every Friday for new videos. Until next time, I wish you all boundless wisdom and metta. Peace